Please give an Edinburgh welcome to Tommy McKearney. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Sam, as well. On a very personal note, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Revolutionary Communist Group, authors of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and to Sam and Paul for this invitation to be here in Edinburgh on the 12th of May, 100 years after the execution of, I would argue, probably Edinburgh's most famous, and if not should be, and certainly its greatest son, James Connolly. It's very moving for me to be here tonight, and it's a real honour to be here speaking to you about James Connolly. For many years in Ireland, after the 1916 Rising, and particularly after the Treaty of 1922, when what many of us would describe as the victory of the counter-revolution in 1922, when the right wing reasserted its authority, it was impossible to dismiss the 7 signatories of the proclamation of the Republic. But what did happen was the overlooking, the parking, the setting aside of James Connolly, and the promotion of what in fairness was a very one-sided and distorted view of Patrick Pearse. It was promoted a view of Pearse as a religious, bloodthirsty fanatic, which is an exaggeration of someone that wasn't really any of those things, but what it did do was allowed Pearse's name and reputation and history to overshadow that of James Connolly and the essential message of Connolly, for the very simple reason, and I hardly need to say it, that Connolly's message was so important, but it was so potentially devastating to the right-wing establishment in the south of Ireland, or what's now the Republic of Ireland, but equally so in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And for that reason, let's then say that Connolly was and remains more than just a Republican martyr, an Irish martyr. He was more than someone about which Republicans and Socialists should pay lip service. One of Connolly's very earliest observations in Ireland was that he talked about the partition of Ireland, and he said it would be a betrayal of the national democracy of industrial Ulster. It would lead to, and this was a phrase that has been used so many times, he said it would lead to a carnival of reaction, north and south. It would set back the wheels of progress, would destroy the oncoming unity of the Irish labour movement, and paralyse all advanced movements while it lasted. And note that when Connolly talked about the carnival of reaction, he wasn't just talking about the north. He wasn't just talking about Northern Ireland, those 6 counties, although there certainly was a carnival of reaction in the northern section, the northern jurisdiction, but equally so there was a carnival of reaction in Southern Ireland, in the 26 county state. A carnival of reaction, partly because of partition, but certainly facilitated by partition. And those messages, that one alone from Connolly, would have had devastating, and did have devastating consequences, and remains to have devastating consequences when it's fully analysed, fully examined. And the power of Connolly and the power of his message is something that the establishment in Ireland, north and south, is certainly afraid of. And I would suggest the power of James Connolly's thinking, the power of his work, the power of his writing, and the power of his life, even here in Scotland, in Britain, is something that is a threat to the establishment, to the established order. It's a threat to the imperial dominance when it's analysed and if it were to be accepted. What I will do is very quickly, and I'm sure you may well be aware of this, some of you, but I'll very quickly run through a very brief background to the historical events or the main dates in Connolly's life, and not deal with it in any great length, but just to highlight some of the more important dates. Connolly, by 1895, was secretary of the Scottish Socialist Federation. He was a socialist of many years standing, had been a member of the British Army. He left the British Army, left effectively, would be described as a deserter, although he had served many years within the British Army, joined the British Army for the reason many others had over the years, out of pure poverty and in need of employment. And his experience in the British Army left him with a very jaundiced view of that institution and the establishment which the British Army served, the British imperialism. But he saw in 1896 an advertisement for a position in Dublin, an organiser of the Dublin Socialist Society, which he answered on for a very paltry sum of money. Connolly's, although born here in Edinburgh, in Cowgate, where we were standing tonight in tribute to him, his parents, his family, came from County Monaghan in Ireland. He had a clear affinity with Ireland, obviously, and even his name itself suggests that, Connolly. In Ireland, very shortly after forming the Dublin Socialist Society and becoming its organiser, he changed that to the Irish Socialist Republican Party. However, various disputes within what was a small party, a small group of people and a poorly financed group of people, centring around priority or the lack of it to be given to the party paper, caused Connolly to leave Ireland in 1903 after ongoing disputes around the funding and financing of the newspaper The Workers' Republic. So in 1903, married with children, for economic reasons as much as anything else, Connolly emigrated to the United States, and there he founded the Heart newspaper, which was addressed to Irish immigrants first and foremost, and into which he was contributing a socialist and left-wing and workers' message. By 1908, he had become an organiser for the industrial workers of the world, or otherwise the Wobblies, known as. And in many United States cities, he lectured on socialism and socialism of the era of the Second International, its theories and its practices. In 1908, he was a founding member of the Irish Socialist Federation, which was, as the name suggests, it was a socialist federation aimed at Irish immigrants and the children and generations of Irish immigrants in the United States at a time when there was a great struggle for the hearts and minds of the working class in the United States, when the message of socialism, the message of industrial organisation was becoming very pertinent and getting a purchase on the working class in the United States. By 1910, however, he decided to return to Ireland from the United States. In 1911, he became the Belfast organiser for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union, the IT and GWU, had been formed the year previously, and in itself was one of the great organising vehicles of organised labour in Ireland, if for no other reason that it was a major and significant shift away from being a branch of the British trade union movement, although it certainly had its affiliations with the British movement, but it was an organic and indigenous Irish trade union movement, founded and led originally by Jim Larkin, but by 1911 it had appointed Connolly as its organiser in Belfast City, and he worked there as the organiser until 1913, when the great lockout and the general strike in Dublin took place, and Connolly was effectively seconded from Belfast to help organise the Irish Transport and General Workers Union on their lockout in the prolonged strike, which lasted from August of 1913 into January of 1914. The general lockout, the lockout failed to break the employers, and it ended ostensibly in failure, but through that period, as a result of vicious assaults on the working people of Dublin and their supporters, during which time several of them were actually beaten to death by the police, Larkin and Connolly organised a workers' militia called the Irish Citizen Army, which was to have a very significant impact on the coming history of Ireland. By 1913 he had revived the Workers' Republic, the paper that he had originally set up in his first period in Dublin. The paper actually was banned in 1915 because of its strident opposition to the First World War. In 1914 he opposed participation in World War I, and in 1916 he was a key figure in the Easter Rising, the insurrection of Easter, and for that he was executed. Now, there is Connolly the theorist, which is vitally important. There is a tendency at times in Ireland to lionise the dead, to make martyrs of the dead, but safely assign them thereafter to their graves, never to analyse their objectives, to try and overlook their cause, and not to disturb the status quo by analysing the politics for which they give their lives. And that is one of the difficulties, one of the objectives in many ways of those that would have Connolly remain as a photograph, as an icon, as something to be admired but not studied and not thought about. Connolly himself one time said that the Irish are not philosophers as a rule, and he said they proceed too rapidly from thought to action. Now, he may have been right. There's many occasions when some of us trying to organise in Ireland think maybe we should maybe move a wee bit quicker to action, but that's another observation we can look at some other time. One of the significant disputes, issues, battles Connolly fought, and I would argue that there's several very, very important seminal pieces of thinking that Connolly contributed to the general understanding of the organised labour movement, the revolutionary labour movement, and pertinent, obviously in Ireland, but pertinent and relevant beyond the shores of Ireland. And one of the first big philosophical disputes, ideological disputes that Connolly entered into was with, not in Ireland at all, but with Daniel de Leon in the United States, and it was a struggle for trade unionism. And that really took place in 1904. 1910, Connolly made a massive contribution to Irish history and to the understanding of Irish history when he published his marvellous work called Labour in Irish History, which was one of the first attempts to not to introduce the class struggle to Ireland, because as we know class struggle has existed from the dawn of history, but to be interpreted on paper and to see Irish history not just as a series of battles and struggles with kings and death, but as a battle of classes. In the same year he also had a major philosophical dispute with the Catholic Church. 1911 was his struggle with what's known as the Connolly-Walker struggle, rejecting the case for a purely British labour movement in Ireland. And of course in 1916 his ideological support for the and practical support for the 1916 Rising. To look at that and to go back through it, his thinking was clearly the socialism of Marx, the conventional Marxism of his time. He was a product of the Second International, and it was the Second International which in some ways was dominated theoretically by European and continental thought, by the Germans, by the French, by the Italians, and because of its nature, and those of us that speak English in Britain, Scotland, Ireland and the United States, particularly in these islands, we tend to be very single language monoglot. We don't tend to speak other languages. So in many ways the thinking was, while it could be translated into English, we didn't have the same lively debates that might have existed on the continent of Europe. And for that reason, the thinking that existed within the American trade union movement, personified by Daniel de Leon, was created and mistakenly created within the United States. And what de Leon and his supporters were arguing was that the trade union movement was of less significance than it would have been deemed in Europe. And their view was that, say, the battle for wages was irrelevant, because if workers achieved an increase in their wages, that prices would simply be put up, and therefore cancel out the advantage of getting an increase in wages. So de Leon and his supporters actually viewed the trade union struggle as less relevant, not of any great importance, and that concentration should be on promoting the revolution, dispense with the trade unionism, organised labour, and work purely for revolution. Connolly argued that that wasn't the case, that the trade union movement, while having its limitations, while having its obviously is not capable of definitively delivering the revolution, that Connolly argued in terms of the education, the first meeting between the working class and the class struggle, its first coming to consciousness, was via the labour struggle, and the struggle for labour. Connolly said that the trade union movement was an essential part of it. Now, as it turned out, de Leon was able, because of his influence over the socialist movement in the States, he was able to curb Connolly's contribution. He was able to censor his writings. He stymied his written contributions to the socialist media in the United States at the time, and Connolly was forced to write his rebuttal of the de Leon position and have it published in Britain, which of course we can now access it, we can now understand the theory and the trend of his thought, but in terms of newspapers printed by the left in Britain at the time, they certainly weren't circulated to any great extent in the United States. And Connolly, while experienced huge frustration in terms of what had happened to him personally in the United States at the time in that controversy with de Leon, he felt that he didn't get an opportunity to put his case. But in terms of the overall theoretical contribution that Connolly made to the left, to organised labour, to the socialist movement and to the revolutionary socialist movement, he defined the role of trade unionism, and he did so within the English-speaking world, which was and remains one of the great contributions where, in terms of the educational value of trade unionism, and trade unionism as Connolly defined it would be qualitatively different to trade unionism as perhaps defined today by either the TUC in Britain or the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the ICTU in Ireland, where there is a tendency, and more than a tendency, to seek redress through legislation, as distinct from the mobilisation of working people. And that happens here, and I mean, it's happening right across the world, but certainly when we see, for example, the enormous emphasis that Francis O'Grady is putting on legislation coming from the European Union as distinct from the mobilisation of the working class, you have to ask the question, well, you know, how much or what do you expect to come from the neoliberals in Brussels, if that's what you're going to pin your hopes on. But the Connolly, with his rejecting the idea that socialism will come without the organisation of labour as an integral part to it on one hand, and the combative mobilisation of the working class on the other hand, pertinent then, and I would suggest certainly pertinent to this very day. And that's one of the major seminal issues, points, argued by Connolly, the Connolly de Leon controversy, which he sought to establish not the supremacy or the primacy of the organised labour movement, but the essential nature of participating in the struggle of organised labour in terms of educating, organising working class people towards the seizure of power by the working class. The other major contribution Connolly made then, and in terms of Irish history, was his publication of a small pamphlet, in many ways, a booklet called Labour in Irish History. And what he did was he inserted socialist republicanism into the struggle for national democracy. And he came up with several theories, several observations that undoubtedly remain valid and essential to today's understanding. But prior to Connolly defining labour in Irish history, there had been certainly observations made by among others, Marx and Engels in their observations, but they had never focused to the same extent on Ireland. And Connolly, instead of accepting what was then a very bourgeois, a very romantic view of Irish history as a series of battles between, in sometimes a promotion through the 19th century by Catholic theologians and historians, bringing to the fore the Irish history as if it was a struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, when quite simply it wasn't. That it was this heroic struggle between the native indigenous Irish of the blood against the English, and that this heroic struggle had taken place, and that the one and only difficulty was the English and the undercurrent of English and English Protestants. Again, Connolly said no, and Connolly identified the class element in Irish history, and he went right back and he talked and illustrated that. What he also illustrated very clearly, yes, imperialism was there. Imperialism at the time, and colonialism had been facilitated and delivered through an English state, an English monarchy, an English colonialism, a British state, and a British parliament, but also that this had been facilitated to another extent largely by the class divisions within Ireland, and had been facilitated by the ruling class in Ireland and the various class interests, where not only had this facilitated the system that had happened in Ireland, it only perpetuated, but what he also was saying was that revolution and struggle, there is if you like, a series of steps where as he said, only the Irish working class remain as the incorruptible inheritors of the fight for freedom in Ireland, because as he said, as a class becomes content with whatever progress has been made at the time, that class will stop the revolution, will stop the progress as it becomes contented with the status quo. And not only will they become contented with the status quo, not only will they agree to stop the movement of progress and freeze it at that particular time, but they will in turn become hostile to those who are pushing forward. And as he said, the Irish capitalist class had always been prepared to abandon and betray the struggle for liberation if its economic and social interests were threatened. That had happened, as he pointed out, with Daniel O'Connell, as he talked about the parliamentary party, he talked about the various betrayals, and this was to become even more pertinent after his death. The theory of stop the revolution, we want to get off, we want to have it frozen at this point in time, and it's something that remains very, very relevant in terms of Irish history of the present and over the last century, where we're seeing the class interest stopping the movement of progress. The large farmers, the Irish capitalist class that had supported Home Rule in 1922, supported a treaty and ruthlessly crushed those that wished to press forward it wasn't just a matter of how far they could go, it was a matter of stopping it. And time after time this has happened. Obviously not just in Ireland, but it's a lesson that has been missed on too many occasions by Irish Republicans, believe it or not, who have a fascination with a different explanation, an explanation that runs around the theory that we have been betrayed by rather than examining the class composition and the reason for why the satisfied class will stop the movement of progress and ruthlessly attack those that wish to press forward. And as he said at the time, only the Irish working class will remain as the incorruptible heirs and people willing to struggle to finally bring about a workers' republic. And that was in many ways outlined first in Labour and Irish history by Connolly. Seminal change in terms of the understanding of Irish history. Another significant battle he fought was with a series of essays he wrote, Labour, Nationality and Religion in 1910. Not only had he outlined in 1910 Labour and Irish history, identified the centre part of the class struggle, but he also challenged the Irish Catholic Church. And the Irish Catholic Church is more than just a theological phenomenon. The Irish Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church in Ireland, the way he wished to describe it, has long been not just a conservative force in terms of theology and society, but it's also been a bedrock in terms of support for the establishment and the status quo. In the 1790s, the British government funded what we call Maynooth, which is the seminary for Catholic priests, put a huge amount of money in to counteract the influence and effect of the French Revolution. And ever since, the Irish Catholic Church has been the bastion theologically and ideologically and psychologically of, and you can take your choice between conservatism and outright reaction. The Catholic Church has invariably at all times supported the more and most conservative elements within Irish society. And when in 1910 a member of the Jesuits challenged reasons that it had its interest in supporting the Conservative Home Rule Party, Connolly replied. He replied to Father Robert Keane, Jesuit from the Catholic Truth Society, who was attacking in a series of sermons. He attacked socialism at a time when the organised labour movement was building up. Connolly attacked it, and he also he made a very determined move to do that. The thing about it that he was doing that at a time when it was far from popular, and it certainly wasn't. It wasn't easy to do that at that particular time, but it was an essential stage in combating the damaging and all-pervasive and detrimental influence of the Catholic Church, particularly within the working class. And he attacked them for the public control and management of the national schools, and he demanded that the national schools, their board of directors, be elected by popular ballot rather than having as the chairman of the board of directors. And he said, whenever the clergy succeed in conquering political power in any country, the result has been disastrous, he said, not only to the interests of religion, but inimical to the progress of humanity. These were words that were not often heard in Ireland at the time, not often heard in Ireland in the present day, even to this day, when the Catholic Church has certainly lost a considerable amount of purchase. It's still possible, as the old phrase is, to take a belt from a crozier. The other great philosophical, ideological contribution of Connolly at that time and to Irish history in general, and this would be something to the history of the Irish labour movement, the Irish socialist cause, and pertinent also across all of these islands, is what we call the Connolly-Walker controversy. And this was the dispute, debate, conflict over the role of imperialism within the labour movement. The Labour Party in Britain, what's very eloquently highlighted by Sam here earlier on when she mentioned the fact that the Labour Party welcomed the execution of Connolly. Now, the British Labour Party has had a long and fairly inglorious history in terms of Ireland. We can mention a long list of colonial oppression coming from the ranks of the British Labour Party, in spite of some fine people within it at the same time. But William Walker was a Belfast man. He was part of the socialist movement, but he advocated not only would all of Ireland join the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, but that it would be the only party. Connolly advocated building not a Labour Party, British Labour Party in Ireland, but an Irish Labour Party. And he identified the fact that imperialism was the problem, that for the working class to progress, that it required to have its independence, that the need to establish a workers' republic was essential. And that wouldn't happen. First, it wouldn't happen within a United Kingdom which included all of Ireland on one hand, and secondly, that couldn't be done if it was to be done with deference to British imperialism. Now, the implication of that is that within Belfast, within parts of northern, what's now Northern Ireland, not at all, but within parts of North East Ireland, where there was a considerable unionist majority, where there still is a unionist majority, there was also very strong pro-imperialist feeling. And Walker was arguing the case that in order to bring the unionist working class in behind the socialist movement, behind the Labour Party, that it was necessary to, one, have it as a British Labour Party so that you would assuage the unionist feelings of what's effectively the Protestant working class, but it would also be necessary to defer to imperialism, respect for the British Crown, respect for the British military, respect for the British Empire, but at the same time advocating better conditions for the working class. And Connolly profoundly disagreed with that. And he said it was impossible to achieve progress, to have socialism while also deferring to imperialism. Some of his statements made that a friend of the oppressor is no friend of mine, that if the oppressed, when I see in every oppressed person a friend, no matter whether they're Irish or not. And he effectively accused Walker of pandering to Orangism in order to gain support within the Protestant unionist working class. Connolly said that was a profoundly mistaken view, and that it certainly wouldn't succeed even in the short term. This was something actually, interestingly, a point made 20 years after his death by followers of Connolly, George Gilmer, Padre O'Donnell, Frank Ryan, when they established the Republican Congress in 1934, and their position in terms of the unionist or Protestant working class was that it's counterproductive to attempt what you might describe as socialism by seduction. What Connolly had said, and what was supported 20 years later by the Republican Congress, was that only an honest approach to treat the Protestant unionist working class as intelligent, discerning people, and point to the fact that a workers' republic was in their interests, not to try and tell them that it can be accommodated within an imperialist setup. and wherever you might lose in the short term, the principled position, the watertight position would hold good in the long term, and that was Connolly's argument with Walker. And I illustrate this in terms of the Republican Congress came with the same concept 20 years later, succeeded actually paradoxically in bringing a number of what would otherwise have been seen possibly as the Protestant working class into their remit, and very famously bringing them to Bodenstown in 1934, which is one of the Republican shrines, you could say, the graveside of Wolfe Tone. And even to today, we can see the argument remains: can you really make progress in Northern Ireland if you don't actually stick to a position where we can only chance end sectarianism, not by accommodating imperialism, not by accommodating the symbols of monarchy, which embodies the class supremacy of a group, by trying to obscure the fact that only through the promotion of a workers' republic, of a socialist republic, will we overcome those sectarian divisions. And that was the Connolly-Walker controversy, which as I say, has resonance to this very day. And I would argue, I would suggest resonance certainly beyond Ireland, that it's impossible to accommodate socialism, the workers' republic, the workers' state, with a deference or a tolerance for imperialism or the class struggle. I don't want to stray too far into Scottish politics, but it strikes me as how you could retain Her Majesty if you're going to, as a head of state, if you're talking about building a socialist fabric. I can't see how you can win the class struggle if you retain the class that oppresses. Right, let's move on a little bit from the major ideological, if you like, the seminal issues that Connolly identified through his life. Connolly, for obvious reasons, was an adherent of the Second International and the positions of the Second International. He was dead before the Third International, the Comintern, would have been established. But as such, the classic position, the long-established position of the Second International, was not to engage in imperial war, that the working class would not take part and should not be encouraged to take part in imperial war, and if an imperial war broke out, that in the words of the Internationale, we'll turn our guns on the generals on our own side, that it'll make civil war rather than imperial war. And Connolly stuck very firmly to that position when war broke out in 1914. And alone, probably among many of the socialist organisations of Europe, with the exception of the Bolsheviks, Connolly worked to transform imperial war into civil war. And there was nothing either unprincipled about the stand he took, nor was there anything opportunistic. He described this as a disastrous calamity for working class people in Ireland and right across Europe. The working class of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, disastrous. But by 1915, his predictions were becoming ominously clear even in Ireland. In 1915, the battle for a second front in the Dardanelles and Gallipoli had cost, in a number of months, 3,000 Dublin Fusiliers had died in Gallipoli alone. In the course of the war, these figures are always somewhat difficult, but at least 49,000 Irish died in the First World War, and you have to then consider wounded, amputees, people that, it was called shell shock at the time, but mentally disabled for forever after, and that's in a population of 4.5 million people. I don't think I have to tell this audience the disastrous consequences of war, but he was determined that this would have to stop. And he also saw that the Irish Parliamentary Party, the so-called constitutionalists, were arguing for war. The Irish Parliamentary Party, the nationalists in other words, in their press had said, we will prove ourselves fit to be in the British Empire by fighting in the hope that after the war is over we'll get home rule. And Connolly had dismissed this as a full of nonsense, which it clearly was. But by 1916 he had saw that there was, as he described in one of his articles in his paper, that he called it a union for reactionary forces. And what was happening, and he used the example of the management of Jacob's Bakery. There was a Jacob's Bakery in Dublin at the time, made biscuits and cakes. It was a huge bakery in Dublin, run by the capitalist class. But Jacob's management was using very, very nasty blackmail tactics on the workforce. What they were saying, if the young men working in the factory, if they were military age, they were being sacked if they didn't join the army. And if there was older men or women, if they had young sons of military age, they were told either they would have to get their sons to join the army or they would be sacked. Connolly obviously condemned this type of action, but what it caused him to see was the need to turn this brutal imperial war in the continent into, as he decided, as he called it, as they talked about, a civil war. At that time, the other organisation, and this is where in many ways I suppose you could describe it maybe in some ways as the genius of James Connolly. James Connolly was someone who was steeped in the understanding of socialism as outlined by Marx, the Marxist concept, the Marxist definition of class, the analysis of society through the prism of a class analysis. And Connolly knew that to make insurrection, he was going to have to look at the class forces and how you would accumulate the forces necessary to bring about insurrection, and realise that Ireland of the early 20th century, that the predominance did not lie with, in terms of the class, did not lie with the industrial working class. They just simply didn't have the numbers. The greatest or the largest class in Ireland at the time was the peasant, the small farmers and peasantry. And classically, the small farmers and peasantry of Ireland owed their political insurrectionary allegiance not to the Irish Transport and General Workers Union or the Citizen Army as Connolly had organised, but to an older organisation which had its radical roots as well, and that was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenians, and an organisation which had actually had some of its members as members of the First International, which was regarded by Marx and Engels as a revolutionary organisation capable of contributing to the eventual class struggle. By 1914, the IRB had, if you like, had three schools of thought within the IRB. It had been reorganised by an old Fenian called Tom Clark. Tom Clark had brought it back from being when Clark come back from the United States. Clark had spent 15 years in Britain, in jail in Britain for a Fenian dynamiting campaign. Was released, spent a few years in the States, and come back to Ireland in 1907 to re-energise the Fenian movement. It had become, if you like, an old boys club. He brought in young men, but had reorganised the Fenians. But even by 1914, by 1915, while the IRB was theoretically committed to insurrection, there was three schools of thought. One said that unless there was which was the Fenian constitution actually, unless there was a majority in favour of insurrection in the island, that it wouldn't happen, and that was constitutionally, according to the constitution of the IRB, it was a correct position. and that position was articulated by a man called Bulmer Hobson. The other group, personified or epitomised by a man called the O'Rahilly, and they were saying, yes, we might have an insurrection, but let's wait until Britain is defeated, and we'll go then. And the third position by Clark, who said, we can't wait, we've got to have an insurrection. But he was outnumbered on the Supreme Council of the IRB. Connolly, whether he was aware of that or not, Connolly threatened to stage an insurrection. What he done was he effectively blackmailed the IRB, who, being afraid that Connolly would stage an insurrection on his own, in many ways leave them embarrassed if the Citizen Army went without the IRB. The IRB were forced to reconsider, and what they did was they co-opted Connolly into the IRB. So Connolly was formed part of the IRB then and set up its military council, a 7-man military council, and the military council of the IRB would become the 7 signatories of the proclamation. And as a result of that, Connolly was able to effectively force the IRB to come along and join the insurrection which took place. It started on the 24th of March. Connolly was in charge of Republican forces in Dublin. He was the commandant of the Republican forces in Dublin through the week. And Connolly was twice wounded through the week. And as the week come to an end, as the surrender of the Republican forces come about, Connolly at that stage was confined to a stretcher. There is a theory, and I'll just, if I can, just try and overturn it, that Connolly and his IRB comrades and the Citizen Army had set off, and this is something that's been promoted, that it was a theatrical gesture just to effectively gain martyrdom, and hoping that the emotionalism of that would lead to an insurrection or a further insurrection in Ireland. The facts are a lot different to that, because that, if you like, promotes a theory that the Irish people are sort of passive, docile, sheep-like people and quite accommodating of imperialism or whatever is there, only for the input of every now and again the bloodthirsty fanatics that lead these poor docile people astray and lead them into seditious insurrection. The fact is that they had planned to land 20,000 rifles. They were to come from Germany, modern rifles at the time. Had that come, that Ireland, certainly if they were able to hold Dublin for a week with 1,000 armed volunteers, they could certainly have held the island for longer with 20,000 rifles. The British Army would have had trouble containing Dublin. They certainly wouldn't have held the island so easily, or suppressed the island so easily. And keeping in mind that at that stage, by 1916, the British Empire and its allies, and the French allies, had reached stalemate on the continent. This was widely known at the time. Maybe not widely promoted in the British press, but it was known to those that wanted to see it. The effects on the continent was Germany had to lose. Germany only had to avoid defeat to win the war. So stalemate actually would have meant Germany would have won the war. The British Empire ended effectively, and it started its terminal decline began in 1917, when, in order to stave off the stalemate, because Britain and its allies had to go straight through to Berlin, or at least threaten Berlin. Britain knew that to stave off that, they were going to have to bring in military assistance from the United States. And had there been a bloody suppression in Ireland, it would have been politically impossible for the US to come into the First World War. So Britain would have been faced with a dilemma. So there was a rationale behind what was happening. It didn't come about. The guns didn't land, but it wasn't by any means a desire for martyrdom. It's something to think about, because Connolly of all people was not an emotionally led person. He was a pragmatist of the highest order. Connolly commanded the garrison. He commanded every garrison in the city. He held the city for a week against, the numbers are difficult to be sure about. We're talking about 1,000 to 1,400 Republican Republican volunteers became the Citizen Army. Citizen Army lost heavily, probably 20% of the Republican casualties in the week were Citizen Army. The Citizen Army had 250 men and women. Let's be very clear about it, because the Citizen Army alone recruited women on parity with men. And the Citizen Army lost about 20% of the Republican casualties were Citizen Army. They had about 250 people committed. The IRB had about 1,000, so proportionately they suffered extraordinary casualties. But Connolly at the end, he sent word around, the famous words, which I think were strangely enough echoed some years later, when he said, never had people a grander cause, and never was a cause more grandly served, which somehow echoes another, I think sometimes, words of Churchill. I think maybe plagiarised it later on in one of his speeches. Connolly, wounded on a number of occasions, was court-martialed, wasn't able to stand when they took him into the Stonebreaker's Yard to be executed on the 12th of May. So strapped into a chair, Connolly was strapped and shot and executed. But as he said himself, I'm finishing on this, the great words, that only the Irish working class remain as the incorruptible inheritors of the fight for freedom. And what he said was this, very importantly, and it's been quoted many times: if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. Because England will still rule you. She will rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individual institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. But if you shift that a little bit around, you don't really need to say England will still rule you. You could put down, if you like, say, let's just change it a little bit and say that unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain, because the ECB, the European Central Bank, will still rule you. Capitalism will still rule you through capitalists, through landlords, through the financiers, and that whole array of commercial and individual institutions to which the Southern Irish state at this point in time can't pass its own budget without first sending it to Brussels. There are messages there that remain very pertinent, not only to the man that died 100 years ago today, but to this very day. And the last words I'll say is here, James Connolly and his legacy. Connolly said, the Irish people will only be free when they own everything, from the plough right up to the stars. And that's, as you can see it, that's the reason, that's the thinking behind the flag of the Citizen Army, Connolly's flag, the plough and the stars, the starry plough. That when, as a people, we own everything, from the plough in the field right up to the stars. So I hope I haven't spoken for too long, but thanks a million for listening.